February 20-3, 1940-4,000 feet above Rabaul, Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai gripped the control column tightly. His eyes fixed through the gun sight on the ungainly silver shapes emerging from the clouds below, 6 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses lumbering toward Simpson Harbor. Their polished aluminum skin gleaming coldly in the tropical sun. These American bombers represented something entirely unfamiliar in his combat experience. As the young ace of the Tainan Air Group, Sakai had shot down enemy aircraft with ease over China, shredded obsolete biplanes above Hankou. He had sent British Brewster Buffaloes tumbling into the Java Sea, yet these American bombers were massive and refused to die easily. Sakai studied the lead fortress through his gun sight as it maintained steady course toward the harbor 2 miles below, for right cyclone engines driving the 30-ton machine. Through thin air at altitudes where his Zero's performance began to suffer, the bomber's distinctive tail fins identified it as a B-17 Auto, the newest variant. Intelligence briefings at Rabaul had warned Japanese pilots about these aircraft, American heavy bombers with defensive firepower unlike anything encountered before. Multiple machine guns of 50 caliber, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute, guns that could reach out and touch a fighter at distances exceeding half a mile. What Sakai and his comrades were about to discover would fundamentally alter Japanese tactical doctrine for bomber interception. The Americans had brought a revolutionary concept. The Americans had brought to the Pacific a weapon system built around a single revolutionary concept, sustained defensive fire that would change everything. Sakai pushed the throttle forward, and his Zero swooped toward the nearest fortress like a hawk, choosing to approach from the rear 6 o'clock position. This was his customary attack angle that had served him well in China and Southeast Asia, but as his distance closed to 800 yards, the tail turret suddenly rotated. To 50 caliber machine guns spat fire, tracers arcing through the sky toward him in deadly curves, forcing Sakai to react instantly. Sakai instinctively pulled the stick and evaded, his Zero slipping sideways to dodge the first burst, then readjusted and closed in again from a 40-5 degree angle. But the waist gunners along the fuselage midsection had already swung their guns toward the attacking Zero, muzzle flashes marking the weapon's positions as gunners opened fire. The top turret rotated and added its 2 guns to the barrage. The tail turret tracked Sakai's fighter through its traverse arc and joined the defensive fire. 7 heavy machine guns concentrated on a single Zero. Sakai had never experienced anything like it. The tracers came in continuous streams. They came in streams that seemed to fill the air between his fighter and the fortress. Every 4th or 5th round was a tracer creating visible paths through the sky. For every visible tracer, 3 or 4 non-tracer rounds flew along the same trajectory, invisible until they struck something, forcing Sakai to break off his attack earlier than intended. He rolled his Zero, inverted and dove away, escaping the defensive envelope as his wingmen pressed their attacks and encountered the same wall of lead. One Zero took hits in the engine cowling and began trailing smoke. Another had its rudder perforated by multiple strikes as the 6 B-17s droned onward toward their target. Bomb-bayed oars opened and bombs fell away toward the ships in Simpson Harbor below. The Americans had delivered their ordnance despite determined fighter opposition. They had done so by creating zones of defensive fire that Japanese pilots could not penetrate without accepting catastrophic risk. What impressed Sakai most was the sustained nature of the fire. Japanese bombers carried limited ammunition for their defensive weapons, perhaps a few hundred rounds per gun at most. Each position could engage for perhaps 30 seconds. But the B-17's gunners seemed to fire endlessly. They shot, paused, and shot again, and the ammunition belts seemed infinite, creating a defensive bubble that fighters could not penetrate. Japanese fighters could not remain inside long enough to deliver lethal strikes. They had to attack quickly, shoot quickly, and disengage quickly. Quick attacks meant reduced accuracy. Reduced accuracy meant more attacks were needed, and more attacks meant more exposure to defensive fire, This was a lethal cycle. The B-17's ammunition capacity was the engine of this lethal cycle. To understand why its defensive firepower so shocked Japanese pilots, one must trace the aircraft's origins. Boeing's model to -90-9 prototype first flew on July 20-8, 1930-5, from Boeing Field in Seattle. A Seattle Times reporter coined the name Flying Fortress. Richard Williams noted the 5 machine gun positions bristling from the fuselage. Boeing immediately recognized the marketing value and trademarked the name. But the original Fortress carried only 5 rifle-caliber 30-caliber machine guns, hardly the armament that would later characterize the aircraft as combat experience proved inadequate. Combat experience in Europe during 1940 and 1940-1 demonstrated that German fighters could overwhelm such limited defensive firepower with relative ease at horrific cost. American designers studied British combat reports and began redesigning the Fortress's defensive suite. The B-17 model incorporated these hard -1 lessons with 950 caliber machine guns. The Sperry-powered tail turret provided coverage directly astern. A Sperry-powered dorsal turret behind the cockpit commanded the upper hemisphere with twin guns. A remotely operated ventral turret covered the belly, though this system proved problematic in service. Flexible guns at the waist and nose provided additional coverage. Total ammunition load for a B-17 approached 5,000 rounds distributed across all positions. The tail gunner had approximately 300 rounds per gun. Top turret gunner controlled 500 rounds per weapon. Waist gunners enjoyed the largest allocation with up to 600 rounds per position. This represented far more ammunition than Japanese planners had anticipated American bombers could carry while maintaining effective bomb loads at operational range. The 50-caliber Browning M- machine gun itself represented mature and reliable weapons technology. John Browning's design was standardized in 1920-1 and refined over a decade. The air-schooled barrel fired at 750 rounds per minute with an effective range exceeding 1,000 yards. In trained hands, it could penetrate fighter armor at 800. The key to the B-17's defensive system was not just the number and caliber of weapons, but the ammunition capacity that enabled sustained fire across all positions. A typical B-17 carried approximately 5,000 rounds of 50- ammunition distributed across 9 gun positions. The B-17 increased this to 6,000 or 7,000, depending on specific mission requirements and squadron loading practices. Some crews operating at extreme range reportedly carried additional ammunition beyond standard loads. To Japanese pilots accustomed to fighters carrying 60 to 100 rounds of 20-mm cannon ammunition, these numbers seemed almost incomprehensible. 5,000 rounds for sustained fire. Even accounting for barrel overheating and ammunition feed management, the sheer quantity of available ammunition created a defensive capability that Japanese doctrine had never anticipated. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. A single B-17 with 7,000 rounds firing at 750 rounds per minute across multiple positions could theoretically sustain fire for 10 minutes. In practice, gunners fired in bursts rather than continuous streams, managed their ammunition carefully, and coordinated their fire to avoid wasting rounds on targets outside effective range. Japanese pilots began reporting that American bomber firepower seemed never to cease. One's Aero pilot wrote that they attacked 3 times and were driven off each time. Their guns were still firing each time they disengaged, reformed, and attacked again. The cannon ammunition was exhausted after the 3rd attack, but the machine guns continued pouring fire. It seemed impossible. This sense of impossibility was precisely the B-17's defensive design objective. Sakai was not the only Japanese ace shaken by this firepower. During a mid-1940-2 engagement over Rabaul, 3 of Japan's top pilots coordinated an attack on a lone B-17, Their experience perfectly illustrated the ammunition asymmetry. The first pilot dove from the 12 o'clock frontal position, his 20-mm shells striking the bomber's right wing. Debris flew, but the fortress merely shuddered and continued flying. Ota attacked simultaneously from the opposite side, attempting to divide the defenders' attention. His cannon fire struck the bomber's left wing and punctured fuel tanks. But the B-17 self-sealing fuel tanks limited the fuel loss, a technology the Japanese had observed but never implemented as comprehensively on their own aircraft. The third pilot's attack achieved the most dramatic results. His cannon shells penetrated the cockpit area, shattering instruments and wounding the co-pilot as the fortress dropped from formation. Nishizawa signaled his wingmen to prepare for the final attack that would finish the crippled bomber, but as the Zeros repositioned, they faced a critical problem. All three fighters had exhausted their cannon ammunition. They retained only their 7mm machine guns, weapons that had proved largely ineffective against B-17 structure. The rifle-caliber bullets could wound crew members and damage control surfaces, but achieving a catastrophic kill against the fortress's rugged construction required sustained heavy caliber fire they no longer had. The damaged B-17 continued flying, slowly regaining altitude, and eventually disappeared into the clouds. This scene played out repeatedly across the Pacific. Japanese pilots could damage B-17s, make them smoke, leak fuel, and lose altitude, but rarely could they shoot them down before their own ammunition ran out. Meanwhile, the B-17's gunners continued firing throughout the engagement, creating a defensive environment that attackers could not remain inside long enough to deliver a kill. By mid-1940-2, American tactics evolved to maximize the B-17's defensive strengths. Bombers flew in tight formations where each aircraft's guns could support its neighbors. A standard 3- ship element placed bombers close enough that their defensive fields of fire overlapped. Attacking any bomber meant facing fire from all three aircraft simultaneously. 9 bombers in a squadron formation could bring dozens of heavy machine guns to bear on any fighter approaching within effective range. Staff Sergeant Robert Altman described the coordination. We flew number 3 position in the lead element. When Japanese fighters approached, our squadron commander called out attack warnings over the interphone. The moment I saw a Zero lining up for an attack run, I opened fire, so did every other gunner who had a clear shot. We started firing at 600 yards. We knew a single gun was unlikely to hit at that distance, but 8 or 10 guns firing simultaneously was different. You created a wall of fire they had to fly through. Most pilots weren't willing to fly into that wall. This tactic proved devastatingly effective as Japanese pilots faced increasingly dense defensive fire networks. As more B-17s arrived and adopted tighter formations, the cost of attack climbed steadily. But Japanese pilots developed multiple tactics to counter the defensive advantages. The most dangerous was the head minus on attack. Approaching from the 12 o'clock frontal position offered the best attack corridor against early B-17 models with limited nose armament. Warrant Officer Kiyomi Katsuki demonstrated the ultimate expression of this tactic over Rabaul when he deliberately rammed B-17 with his Mitsubishi fighter. But even head minus on attacks became increasingly dangerous. The B-17-SEF model introduced a chin turret with 250 caliber machine guns providing nearly unobstructed forward firepower. This addition closed the most significant gap in the fortress's defensive coverage. Attacking from the rear meant facing the concentrated fire of the tail turret. Attacking from above meant confronting the dorsal turret. Attacking from below meant facing the ball turret's complete spherical coverage. Every approach angle presented problems. The most successful Japanese tactic combined overwhelming numerical superiority with coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, if 8 or 10 Zeros attacked at once. The defensive gunners couldn't engage all threats simultaneously. Some fighters would penetrate the defensive envelope and deliver their fire, but this required concentrating scarce resources. This tactic left other formation members free to continue toward their targets, and it virtually guaranteed fighter losses that Japan's limited pilot training capacity could not easily replace. Production statistics told a story that Japanese planners found increasingly troubling. Boeing Seattle factory alone could produce one B-17 every 3 days by mid-1940-2. Douglas Aircraft's Long Beach plant added additional production capacity. Lockheed's Vegas subsidiary contributed more airframes from Burbank. American industry was ramping up to exceed 12,000 B-17s. Meanwhile, Japan's aircraft production struggled to replace combat losses while expanding to meet growing operational demands. Mitsubishi and Nakajima produced approximately 3,500 Zeros. Total Japanese aircraft production across all types reached approximately 8,600 aircraft for the year. American production exceeded 40,000 aircraft in the same period. Each B-17 required approximately 40,000 individual parts manufactured to precise tolerances by hundreds of subcontractors. The ammunition came from dedicated arsenals producing millions of rounds monthly. Spare parts, replacement engines, and maintenance equipment formed a logistics chain stretching from the American heartland across thousands of miles of ocean to forward bases in Australia and New Guinea. This industrial systems output included not just aircraft and ammunition, but trained crews to fly and maintain them. B-17 crew training programs expanded throughout the war. The 19th Bombardment Group operated from Australian bases, executing some of the war's longest range bombing missions, often flying over 1,500 miles round trip in extreme weather. The 40-3rd Bombardment Group arrived in mid-1940-2. Both groups conducted sustained strikes against Japanese installations at Rabaul, forcing the Japanese to divert air defense resources. But even as B-17 operations reached their peak in the Southwest Pacific, American strategic planners were already making decisions that would reshape Pacific air operations. General Henry Hap Arnold determined that the B-17's shorter range and smaller bomb load compared to the B-20- for Liberator made it less suitable for Pacific operations. The vast distances of the Pacific theater favored the longer ranged Liberator. Additionally, B-17 production was desperately needed for the 8th Air Force buildup in England. European operations would consume the bulk of B-17 production throughout 1940-3 and 1940-4. Pacific Air Forces would receive B-20-4s instead. By mid-1940-3, most B-17s had been withdrawn from regular squadron service in the Pacific. The 40-3rd Bombardment Group transitioned to B-20-4s in August. The 19th Bombardment Group had rotated back to the United States in late 1940-2. A few B-17s remained for specialized roles, including transport and weather reconnaissance. The Fortress's combat career in the Pacific effectively ended after barely 18 months of operations. Japanese pilots who survived and later faced B-20-4s found the Liberator no less challenging. The B-17's legacy in the Pacific extended far beyond the relatively modest number of aircraft involved. These operations demonstrated principles that would guide American strategic bombing throughout the war. They proved that heavy bombers could survive and complete missions despite determined fighter opposition. They validated defensive firepower as a force multiplier for smaller formations. Most significantly, they demonstrated to Japanese military planners that American industrial capacity could sustain weapon systems requiring vast quantities of ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and trained personnel. Seemingly unlimited ammunition was neither magic nor propaganda. It was the product of an industrial system operating at a scale that Japanese industry could never match. By 1940-5, American arsenals had produced approximately 11 billion rounds of 50- caliber ammunition, enough to equip every B-17 and every American fighter and ground vehicle. This staggering output represented industrial capacity that transformed American tactical doctrine from one of ammunition conservation to one of ammunition abundance. Japanese pilots who heard 850 caliber guns were not hallucinating. They were not misunderstanding their tactical situation from their perspective, facing fighters with perhaps 100 rounds of cannon ammunition. An opponent carrying 7,000 rounds seemed infinite. The practical difference was negligible when the asymmetry was so extreme. The mathematical reality of ammunition capacity versus tactical employment created the perception of unlimited ammunition. That perception, whether technically accurate or not, influenced tactical decisions that ultimately favored the defenders. Japanese pilots exercised greater caution in pressing attacks. That caution, however rational given the circumstances, reduced Japanese offensive effectiveness and increased bomber survival rates. This was the B-17's final victory in the Pacific. Not destroying Japanese fighters through superior gunnery, though bomber gunners claimed respectable numbers of aerial victories, not achieving perfect bombing accuracy, though the Norden bomb sight provided unmatched capability, but creating through industrial abundance and tactical employment a defensive system that forced the enemy to fight on American terms that emphasize sustained firepower and mutual support. Terms that emphasize sustained firepower, mutual support, and the material resources to maintain combat operations despite casualties and damage. This was the B-17's true legacy. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's most formidable weapons and the warriors who faced them, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. I'm your aviation historian, bringing you the untold stories of the skies, and I will see you on the next mission.